Today. My name is Amy Wendell. I'm a literacy consultant here at Berea Elementary School in Montgomery, New York. And my co-presenter, Michelle Russell, is a third grade teacher also in Montgomery, New York. So we are here to talk to you today about academic conversations and our journey through trying different strategies. So I hope you enjoy. This past summer, my husband and I took a wonderful trip to Disney World in Florida. Since my husband is deathly afraid of rides, we chose a calmer path and we decided to stroll through Epcot and visit all the different beautiful uh, countries over there. And we were stopped in Italy enjoying a gelato when a group of four energetic teenage girls came and sat beside us and they started playing this game. Um, I think you know the one, the like a charades game where you put your phone up to your forehead and you have to guess a name. But as I sat back and watched them, I noticed a couple of things. I noticed all four girls were engaged. They all had the same purpose for talking and for listening. All four were smiling and laughing. All four were participating. All four were asking questions and getting clarification. And I could see that they came out of the game knowing a little bit more than they had when they started, and possibly even changing their mindset about some of the topics and people, albeit maybe it was about Lady Gaga or Family Guy. It made me think about how to get those ingredients, those conversation ingredients, into our classrooms and how to provide the structure and the strategies for our students to be able to have learning conversations. So, as I thought back about those girls, um, there was a common purpose. Those girls knew the rules for the game and they were all talking about the same things. They had set norms. I mean, granted, they weren't listed up next to them, but they knew the unsaid rules of the game. There was incredible engagement. It was fun. It was exciting. Everybody was involved in the conversation. And when somebody didn't know or wanted some information, they asked questions and they felt comfortable asking questions. So building that community of trust was there. And also clarification. When somebody wasn't sure of something, they asked the question and it was clarified what they meant. And then obviously elaboration. These girls sitting there playing that game were elaborating if somebody didn't know the reference. And even my husband and I came out knowing a whole lot more about social media than we ever thought we would. Now let's take a minute and think about this. Thinking about your own classroom. What kind of conversations are happening? How much time do you allow for students to talk with each other? Is it teacher student conversation? Is it student conversations one on one? Is it small group? Is it whole group conversations? Um, what subjects do you find are better suited for conversations than for other conversations? And what value do you place in providing time, this valuable time to have conversations? These are some of the things that my co-presenter Michelle Russell and I really took time to think about and do some deep work into understanding the value of having these conversations and then actually trying different strategies to see what worked and what didn't work. And if you are an administrator or a support person going into classrooms, take a minute and think about what conversations do you see happening in the classroom? Who's doing the talking? Did you know, according to John Hattie's book, Visible Learning for Teaching, that teachers talk 70 to 80% of the time? So doing the math, that means student talk takes 20 to 30% of the day. Would you say that's about more or less or pretty much the same as your class? Many of us have come back to school and are working with students who haven't been back in over a year. The students' social emotional welfare is our major concern. And it's almost as if we have to treat these students as if English is a new language, school talk, using our voice to share our thinking, also our emotions, and using our words is playing a big part in our learning. As mentioned earlier, the next generation standards were paid close attention to. Thinking about our readers, we want them to think, we want them to write, and we want them to speak and listen to understand. So we focused on the speaking and the listening. I know myself, when I was a fifth grade classroom teacher, having the readers read and write was the focus more so than speaking and listening. But as you see in the standards, readers and writers need to have that speaking and listening supported as well. And if you look at the anchor standards for the next generation standards, comprehension and collaboration, there are 3 standards that do focus on speaking and listening in different settings. We also have 4, 5, and 6 standards, which talk about presentation of knowledge and ideas. So in all of these standards, that concept of being able to hold a conversation around different contexts and with a diverse population is super important. Now, the work that Michelle and I did wasn't our original ideas. We did rely heavily on research that came before us. And so starting out on our journey, Michelle and I read as much as possible about academic conversations, also referred to as purposeful talk, classroom talk, and student talk. We also like to call them learning conversations because we're really hoping that the people involved in the conversations are raising their level of understanding. So all the work we are sharing today comes from the wonderful thinking done before us. We relied heavily on texts such as This Academic Conversations, Classroom Talk that Fosters Critical Thinking and Content Understanding by Jeff Zwiers and Marie Crawford. We also read the K3 Guide to Academic Conversations, Practices, Scaffolds, and Activities, also by Jeff Zwiers, and he collaborated with Sarah Hammerla. Another text that we relied heavily on was Shifting the Balance, 6 Ways to Bring the Science of Reading into the Balanced Literacy Classroom by Jan Berkins and Kari Yates. And they talk a lot about the importance of oral knowledge. And also, Pauline Gibbons wrote English Learners, Academic Literacy and Thinking, Learning in the Challenge Zones. And that was written by Paul Gibbons. So all of these resources were incredibly helpful for us. Another book by Jeff Zwiers we used was The Next Steps with Academic Conversations, and he talks about new ideas for improving learning through classroom talk. So that would be a great resource once you get going to see where to take it next. This Building Bigger Ideas by Maria Nichols. She has great resources on how to think about the language you're using and how to raise the level of accuracy in what you're trying to get across to the students. Two other books we used. One was Unlocking the Power of Classroom Talk, teaching kids to talk with clarity and purpose. And the last one was Teaching Talk, a practical guide to fostering student thinking and conversation. And this one is by Kara Prinikoff. And these were wonderful resources that we used while doing our investigation. So, why are we doing all this? Why is talk so important? Well, according to Hogan, Adloff, and Alonso, 2014, reading comprehension actually begins a long time before children begin to decode. It begins as they learn to understand and use spoken language. Um, Burks and Yates also discuss this concept in their book, Shifting the Balance. So, communication. Why is communication so important? Well, it builds academic language. There are many vocabulary skills that can be learned, literacy skills, language, communication, critical thinking skills. Uh, Zwier and Crawford also mention that it promotes different perspectives and empathy. Conversation fosters equity, creativity, listening skills, engagement, motivation. Conversation cultivates connections. Conversations help students co-construct meaning. Uh, Conversations help teachers hear what students are understanding. And Lev Vygotsky uh, mentions speaking leads to understanding. And in the book Teaching Talk, uh, Kara mentions where this idea of oral language and knowledge leads to better understanding. So, all of our readings really confirmed our thinking about the importance of student talk and why we need to make sure there's time for that in our classroom. Again, it builds the academic language, it promotes different perspectives and empathy, and it fosters that equity, creativity, listening skills, engagement, and motivation. Sometimes we just need to start with the listening, don't we? So, when trouble hits, sometimes you have problems with kids talking in class. Some kids are talking too much, some kids don't say anything. Maybe you don't know how to assess them. How do I know what they're talking about? Sometimes it just gets too loud and out of control, and it's like too much. It's hard to make time for this. Where in the day do you find time to have these conversations? And how do you know if kids are really learning anything and building those conversation skills? And you just don't have enough room in your classroom, just physically. So these are things that Michelle and I ran into that we really struggled through, and we wanted to share some of the strategies that worked for us. So here are the top 5 strategies to help you unlock your students' thinking through talk. Strategy number 1: modeling. Modeling is an effective instructional strategy. It's a form of imitation that fosters student learning. Students need to know exactly what you are expecting from them in order to be successful. Conversations in school can look very different from conversations they have with their friends or families. Maybe they're used to talking over each other. Maybe they text and don't need to make eye contact. Maybe they are unaware of their voice levels, either too soft or too loud. We need to make sure all our students are aware of our expectations. Be procedural with your modeling. Don't expect students to hold full-blown conversations after a few prompts. By starting slowly and adding on, beginning with modeling how to face during a conversation. This can be done in front of the room, having students model in a fishbowl setting with other students observing. Encourage students to practice their new skills at home in a more informal setting. We want to slowly introduce new strategies, starting with listening, how to listen. You can model how to start a conversation. Many times students don't even know how to begin talking with somebody. You also need to model when conversations need to continue and when is a good time to bring up new ideas. How to stay on topic, how to paraphrase, clarify, build, and support and question are continuing skills that would be introduced later, and obviously how and when to end a conversation. There's a difference between dialogic and monologic conversations. Uh, Dialogic is a conversation between the two students, whereas a monologic conversation would be taking place more teacher presenting material to students. So it's a matter of shifting our thinking and shifting our roles. Obviously, there's a place for each type of conversation. Uh, as Pranikoff in Teaching Talk mentions, she says, as students become the meaning makers, the teacher takes the role of the conversational coach, providing ample room for reflection and allowing the class to learn from each other's conversation. And that is something that I really needed to think about as I was delving into this academic conversation, is what exactly my role was. Strategy number 2, multisensory. Multisensory is a way of teaching that uses more than one sense at a time, giving students more than one way to connect with their learning because students learn differently and require different stimuli. We want to make sure we are reaching all of our students. So there are some examples to get us started. One, having students stand up to practice partner conversations. In the turn and talks, when they turn their bodies and face each other, that's another great option. One technique I found very successful was having students learn hand gestures to agree or disagree. They can add on, change the subject, question. But just to note, it's important to have conversations with your colleagues so that all the classrooms and subjects are using the similar hand gestures, because it does get confusing with different teachers using different hand gestures. Each student can hold sentence strips with a conversation prompt. For example, tell me about the last book you read, and having students move around the room to practice asking questions and then switching sentence strips. Move to a new partner. Again, just a note, be sure to be careful with your questions. Try to make them open-ended, not what was the last book you read, but tell me about the last book you read. Hand each student a few tokens or chips. I've been very successful, students have been very successful using these chips or tokens. Sometimes I've even used Scrabble blocks, holding partner small groups, even whole group conversations accountable. Students have to put a chip in every time they speak or every time they ask a question. Even if you just start with one chip, I've found the quiet students are urged to share, allowing time for them to think, and more boisterous students are limited. Strategy number 3, multidisciplinary. Having conversations allows students to discuss ideas, topics, or texts by integrating multiple areas of understanding and schemas. The effective method of teaching crosses curriculum boundaries in order for students to dig deeper and to make multiple connections. And allowing for students to make these connections allows for different perspectives to be heard and collaboration skills to be strengthened. Time is precious commodity in our classrooms. Allowing time for strengthening students' ability to think through conversations will open up doors for deeper learning, connecting subjects and special areas such as literacy, science, math, STEAM, and social studies. It really does take a village. Uh, think of ways to get everyone involved. We make it our literacy team goal, but also our district's goal of academic conversations. Be sure to share goals with all the stakeholders in your school and your district. Developing student academic conversations can take place throughout the day and doesn't have to take long. Class meetings, interactive read-alouds, guided reading groups, writing workshop, word study, shared reading, book clubs, project-based learning are just a few of the times during the day where academic conversations can be practiced and taught. Strategy number 4. Make it messy. There's really no straight line to deep, rich conversations. It's so important to allow time for practice. Having to teach online opened up new technologies for us, such as Flipgrid and Google Breakout Rooms. Students have multiple engaging opportunities to practice talking skills. Again, encourage students to practice with their new academic vocabulary and use of complete sentences at home with friends and family. Strategy number 5, monitor and reflect. One thing a group of teachers did in 3rd grade was to begin with observing what the students were actually doing. So they monitored 3 different groups during turn-in talks to see who actually just turned. And they tracked their observations. And according to their observations, they noticed the green team, which only had 9 students out of 21 turn, needed more support with how to do turn-in talks. They also noticed that this group were sitting in chairs, and that might have an effect on why they had the fewest students turning. So then they provided next steps from their observations, and they are going to observe what they're talking about and if they're staying on topic. So first it was just the actual turning, and then they talked about listening to what they were saying and if they stayed on topic. And then a possible move to practicing sharing what your partner stated. So they set a goal and they set an end date, and they're following up with their next steps. So really baby steps, observations, plan, and then monitor if it was successful. There are lots of different ways you can assess and reflect. Pre-assessments are great because you can see where the students begin and who your students are, and that can be also done through student observations. Now, since the past 18 months, there's a lot of video taken. If you're not comfortable with watching the video, you can also take transcripts and share what the students were actually saying written out during your team meetings or grade level meetings. And then providing students exit tickets so they have a chance for reflection. Also, student surveys, Google Forms are a great way to find out students' thoughts. And finally, post-assessments to see what gains the students have made and where to go next.
My name is Michelle Russell. I'm a 3rd grade teacher at Montgomery Elementary School in the Hudson Valley in New York. This is my 26th year teaching. I have taught grades 2, 3, 4, and 5, as well as ESL, but most of my time has been teaching 3rd grade. For the past 7 years, I've been team teaching. So there are 2 separate classrooms with 2 separate teachers, and I teach reading workshop, writing workshop, and word study. And my partner teaches math, social studies, and science. And then we switch classes halfway through the day. Before teaching, before March of 2020, when I think about my classroom, we started the year by connecting and building class community, conferring, doing small group work and guided reading, having whole class discussions and tons of interactive read alouds on the rug where students could turn and talk. There were assessments where I would sit side by side with students, and there was a lot of paper involved. There were also anecdotal records and other formative assessments. In my conferences, I would sit and meet one-on-one with students to assess their language skills, their reading skills, writing skills, their comprehension. I would think about their processing and listening skills and provide immediate feedback to support them by giving them one or two things to work on at a time. The conferences were used to meet individual needs. I would give out bookmarks or checklists. There were a lot of sentence starters. I could address listening issues and give cues. So when they would hear certain words, they would know what to do right away. And vocabulary needs were met. In my small group work, we would sit at my U table. I had targeted language goals, and listening and speaking goals were established for the groups. The conversations were pretty controlled because I only had a few students, and the repetition of information from conferences or whole class lessons happened in these small groups. And then March of 2020 hit, and everybody went home, and we were learning from home for 3 months. And in September of 2020, when we came back to school, there was such lack of consistency. I started out hybrid, so I had some students at home, some students in school, and they would switch, and then kids were out on quarantine, or they were sick, or they just didn't arrive at school. Some kids only came in person, some kids only came online. There was varied parental support, and I had some parents who were holding me accountable for COVID, and then other parents who kept asking, how can I support my child at home? And any parent in between. So many levels of parental support. We had so many different learning environments. So for the kids who were learning remotely, some were at daycare, some were with grandma, some were with a stay-at-home parent. Some had parents who were working from home while their students were learning from home. Some of them had older siblings taking care of them. And some were in their parents' offices. There were glitchy internet setups, and then others had great Wi-Fi capacity. This really impacted our students' learning. Even teaching and learning with a mask set up the classroom structure so differently. When I was teaching last year, I realized that some things could not be heard through my mask. So I was creating videos for students so they could hear me, and Google Slides. During fully remote days, they would see my whole face, but I tried to pre-record as much as possible so my words were clear. So just the preparation was so new for me. The structure of my classroom was so different too, because for the first time ever, I had rows in my classroom where I always had collaborative groups before. And I had to think of ways to get students to interact while socially distanced. And I needed to think of ways to have them keep their voice volumes down, because when you're sitting distance from someone, you tend to elevate your voice. So there was a lot of yelling going on, and we had to kind of revamp what was going on in the classroom many times. So the other thing that I've noticed now, since I have a whole new set of students coming back into the classroom, is some of these students haven't stepped foot into the classroom since March of 2020. So 18 months out of the school building, just sets up a whole new set of rules and a whole new way of thinking about our students. And I've had to reflect a lot about, you know, what were they doing at home? Did they have Wi-Fi at home? Were they glitching? Were they able to, get everything that was going on? Who have they spoken to in the last 18 months? So I've noticed that some of my students haven't spoken with anyone outside of their immediate family. They haven't left their homes. They haven't interacted with other people. Some of them haven't spoken using complete sentences since March of 2020, or the expectation hasn't been held. So this is opening another can of worms for educators. So what are we going to do with our students, and how are we going to address these issues? So I feel like I've had to take many steps back, maybe go around the block a few times backwards to see where to begin. So, when I was doing the ESL work, I was reading a few books by Gibbons and Gibbons, and I've decided to take a stance where the academic language expectations that we have in the classroom are going to be like a second language for our students. And I'm going to have to provide a variety of experiences and scaffolds so students learn how to speak in a classroom, how to speak using complete sentences again, and how to develop the language in the classroom so the rigor is meeting the level of my personal expectation, but also so we have more successes in the classroom. So I'm going to be providing a lot of ENL scaffolds, such as gestures and models and visuals, and teaching explicit vocabulary, but only teaching one skill at a time, kind of like the literacy framework for Literacy Collaborative. But the one thing I want to make sure that I put in place are sentence stems and frames so that academic language is really clear. Even on the first day of school, I needed to model those language expectations. I went up to a student during an icebreaker and I said, "Hi, I'm Mrs. Russell. What's your name?" And the child looked at me and seemed a little confused that I was introducing myself using sentences. I said to other students, "Notice how I'm going to wait to listen for Noah's response. I'm going to look at Noah. I'm going to face my eyes and belly button toward him to show him I'm practicing listening skills. And when I listen, it shows the other person that I care, and they'll get ready to listen to me too." A lot of the students were afraid to go up to each other or go within 3 feet of one another. Um, they didn't know how to make eye contact. They didn't know how to face one another. They just wanted to fill in the sheet and move on. So I had to stop and do kind of a fishbowl approach to get them ready to listen and to get them to practice to listen in an informal setting. We looked at ways that students could show good listening, and we talked about opening their ears and having that visual for them for what that might look like. Facing the speaker and opening their eyes, and taking turns. Taking turns seems to be a foreign concept today. I also am beginning to encourage them to think about what is being said before they provide an answer. And this way, students aren't speaking out of turn or over talking. One of the things that I encourage throughout the year is to react to the speaker. And one of the things they can do is nod or smile or shake their head no, but that will show their friends that they're listening. So these are things that I'm starting from day one. So, scaffolding conversations to move toward more academic conversations starts out with icebreakers or personal topics, writing before talking, turning and talking before sharing with a whole class, um, and also providing bookmarks with sentence starters. So, what did that look like in my classroom, or what does it look like? Maybe it's an icebreaker activity where they practice brief um, interactions with classmates, finding one person who could answer a question and then moving on to another person. So, we're not looking for sustained conversations at this point of the year. And that's something that we really need to move toward by practicing little short, brief conversations. Um, Looking for people learning how to ask questions. That's really where I'm starting. And then moving on and building. So when I'm introducing in a reading workshop, um, talking about characters or talking about what's going on in a story, for each uh, mini lesson that I give, I want to provide sentence frames at the beginning of the year and then kind of move into just sentence starters and then moving away from that and just giving maybe one word that they can begin their sentence with or that they can elaborate with. So I will give them bookmarks that look something like this at the beginning of the year for skill work, and also so they know how to talk about books. I'm also getting them to jot down ideas in their writer's notebooks before they talk in a conversation in the class or with a partner so they can prepare what they're going to do. So I'll give them things like one thing I did over the weekend. Even backing up from that, sometimes I have them list everything they did over the weekend and then pick one, talking about one hobby or pets or something about their family or their favorite things. So they can zoom in and just kind of think about one thing and then give more information about that. The turning and talking has been so crucial to develop whole class conversations. It's an idea preparation before they talk to the whole classroom. It gives them that confidence that, okay, I'm only talking to one person right now and everybody's not looking at me. And, they have to share with the other person and take their turn. Some of them will more readily share when there's a turn and talk that happens before. And for those kids with processing issues or needing that wait time, it helps them to process the information with a partner because they don't have the stress of sharing with everybody in the class. So I love the turn and talk in an informal setting, in the reading workshop, in the writing workshop, but I try to do it before any whole class interactions. I do a lot of writing before talking where students stop and jot their thinking on a post-it note or stop and jot their idea, or by creating lists or picking a topic and sharing with a partner before talking with the whole class. I also do a lot of elaboration work with writing first and then talking, where they use the WH questions or sequence words and then move into their conversations. So, bookmarks have been and charts have been a great way for my students to scaffold that language and set clear expectations on how they can start their sentences. For my ENL students or students who haven't been speaking in complete sentences for the last 18 months, this gives them the opportunity to take a little bit of the stress away with how their sentence should begin. The reading is thinking from Fountas and Pinnell gives them very clear ideas on how they can begin. I think, I notice, one thing that seems important. These words just give them some kind of frame so then they can move on and speak. But as we move on, when they're having a conversation, the accountable talk sentence frames are important so they can agree or disagree or elaborate. Um, in the interactive read aloud discussions, it gives me the opportunity to model spoken language for my students. I put sentence starters on a chart and I set very clear expectations for my students by telling them we will be using complete sentences when we share our ideas. And if they are not using complete sentences, I bring it back into a conference or I group them into a small group. Um, and that way I can address any needs for speaking in complete sentences. So during the year, I kind of I start with giving them sentence beginnings, sentence frames, sentence stems, and then I move into other ways to say things by giving them the more rigorous academic vocabulary or even giving them other words to use instead of their word choices. Because what I'm noticing from the kids who have been coming into my third grade class, they aren't using vocabulary accurately. So I want them to know, oh, well, I hear the way you're saying this, and maybe a more specific way to say it is. And then I give them vocabulary choices. I also want to clarify information by having them start to ask each other questions. Instead of me constantly sitting there and clarifying information for them, they start to ask one another clarifying questions. I want to hear them paraphrasing um, information. So when they're turning and talking, maybe they'll say, I heard you say, and then paraphrase. And then I want them in their conversations to start elaborating. So I teach them words like, can you say a little bit more about that? And all of this is done through the modeling. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Is done in the interactive read aloud. And then it's in the turn and talk or in the small group discussion.
We hope this time together was meaningful for you. We'd like to thank the Valley Central School District community for supporting our inquiry into academic conversations, and we would love to hear your thoughts. So please don't hesitate to reach out to talk with us about any questions or comments that you have. It is an ongoing inquiry process that we have loved exploring. And thank you for your time today. We just want to end with a little review to see how well we were listening and if you can remember those top 5 strategies. Okay, so let's review. The top 5 strategies, they all started with the letter M, and the first one was, yes, model. Modeling, modeling, modeling. Kids have to see it taught explicitly. They need to hear the words. They need to have time to practice. So model in all you do. Second one, multisensory. Did you guess that? Awesome. Multisensory, using all those different techniques we talked about, having the visuals, having the kinesthetic, having those chips to play with and pass, that makes all the difference. All right, number 3, multidisciplinary. So where do you do it during the day? Do it during morning meeting, do it during social studies, science, while you're waiting in line. There are lots of opportunities throughout the day to have these conversations. Number 4, yes, make it messy. It's not a straight line to those wonderful deep conversations. Kids need to practice. Adults need to practice. And they need to practice to listen. They need to practice using these new words, these new vocabulary words. So take a step back and let the magic happen. All right, our last one, number 5. Do you remember? Yes, monitor and reflect. As an educator, we're always looking to see, are students getting it? How are they responding? And then let the students have time to reflect on what they did well, what their goal is for next time they have a conversation. All right, so top 5 strategies: model, multisensory, multidisciplinary, making it messy, and monitor and reflect. Thank you, and we hope you have a great school year. Happy New Year.